In the beginning, there was World of Warcraft. I start at WoW for argument's sake. Obviously, we're not counting earlier MMOs. And then a few years later, Final Fantasy XIV was born. But it was less than stellar, and if not for the support of a dedicated fan base, could have easily been considered a total failure. However, like all stories that start with, in the beginning, there was a resurrection waiting around the proverbial corner, and shortly after Final Fantasy XIV's initial failed launch, it was reborn. Since then, there has been an ever-growing tension between the two games as each seeks to innovate and improve upon their existing formulas. But today, we're going to discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of each game and compare who's coming out on top. We're going to start with brand recognition, and of course we'll start with WoW. World of Warcraft needs no introduction from millions of players, past or present, and millions more who have never spent a single day in Azeroth. Blizzard has done an excellent job in creating what has been the most successful MMORPG of all time, and equally good job in marketing the product to the masses. WoW's brand recognition is, if not the most well known of any video game currently on the market, definitely in the top 1%. In Final Fantasy XIV's corner, Final Fantasy XIV is the 14th entry into one of the most successful video game franchises ever made, and when you consider all of the entries together, Square Enix easily joins Blizzard in the top percentages of brand recognition. To this day, regardless of how their games may be viewed by critics, millions of people dish out cash to purchase the next Final Fantasy entry, and there are always two camps, those who love it and those who lovingly hate it. For those in the former camp, all of their bile equates to little, since at some point in the next 4-ish years, they will undoubtedly get hooked on the idea and the promise that the next Final Fantasy will bring redemption to the series we all are invested in. Of the two, I feel like Blizzard does a better job overall in promoting their game from a marketing perspective, and there are generations of unborn children who no doubt will experience WoW for themselves one day, even if WoW were to disappear and there were only private servers left, because the legacy it has left on the industry and in the hearts of those who love or have loved it. WoW also differs that it draws upon a pre-existing lore base that preceded its MMO iteration, and had an existing fan base who were not only familiar with its characters, but also had dreamed of interacting with them in a more direct fashion. Final Fantasy XIV, on the other hand, like all games in the series, is a standalone production for which a new world and primary character base was developed. In some ways, the MMO seems like a natural extension of what makes the series great, and Final Fantasy XI, Square Enix's original Final Fantasy MMO, has enjoyed much success and is still running to this day. Due to their huge fan base, Square Enix does not need to spend the kind of money in marketing that many other titles do, although I'm sure they spend quite a bit regardless. Their name brand recognition is superior to even some of the most popular titles today, and many of the people who play MMORPGs have or do enjoy single-player RPGs as well, and have either enjoyed some or all of the many worlds Square Enix has created in the Final Fantasy franchise and their other IPs. To be fair, my exposure to each brand's marketing is based on a US perspective, and I'm sure the opposite is probably true in Japan. It's worth mentioning that if it were up to Australia, Final Fantasy XIV is all we would ever play. Next category is playability. I'm going to incorporate a lot into this topic for the sake of time. What makes the game, quote, playable to one person may be different than what another person considers ideal or, quote, playable. We'll begin with the graphics for Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV's more realistic, although quite colorful and imaginative style, appeals to many people and feels more modern and polished graphically than WoW. Despite the fact that Final Fantasy XIV's graphics are far and away superior to WoW's more cartoonish style, the game is well balanced on what it requires to run at a decent setting. I can maintain 60 frames per second at high graphics settings on my 3-year-old unmodified laptop. Next, we'll look at primary functions. Final Fantasy XIV's primary functions, i.e. jumping, walking, casting, etc., are all smooth and mostly believable. We've all played those games where you jump 30 feet in the air, or you fall from a ledge and you're immediately at the ground below where you drop. For me, that makes a game, quote, unplayable. I appreciate real-time, or close to it, physics in a game, and it adds immersion to the world. I will say that Final Fantasy XIV falls a bit behind WoW in fluidity of movement, but that just may be a difference in the engine that runs them. Finally, we'll look into combat. Final Fantasy XIV has great combat animations, I mean truly top-notch. They flow well and are beautiful, but it's also one of my least favorite aspects of their combat system. Final Fantasy XIV has a long global cooldown. And it even takes the ninja job, which has the ability to reduce the global cooldown so long to cast that it feels like you would get destroyed by even a caster class in World of Warcraft. This does generally get better as you level and additional off cooldown abilities are added, but even at max level, which at time of recording is 70, the combat feels pretty slow and less impactful than other MMOs with a shorter global cooldown. And on to WoW. Again, beginning with the graphics, WoW's graphics are wonderful and unique, but definitely not everyone's cup of tea. It's been a long-standing joke that WoW can be played on a toaster, and while that's less true now, the graphics do feel dated to some degree. Blizzard has updated the graphics religiously, but without recreating the entire game on a new engine, there's a limit to what they can do with it. For a point of reference, however, I'm only able to maintain 60 frames per second on that same laptop with up to the 6th level out of 10 in graphics settings. And while the character models and backgrounds will never look as realistic as Final Fantasy XIV, they are top-notch for the style they represent. Concerning primary functions, this is where WoW has, for me at least, classically outshone its competition. Jumping, falling, walking, casting, mounting, and fluidity of movement is polished and it looks and feels great. Whether you're a keyboard turner or you've mastered moving with your mouse while using keybinds to attack, WoW's mastery of primary movement is what most other games would do well to strive for. And then there's combat. Pretty recently, WoW has done some major changes to a lot of the combat effects and updated class spells and attacks in such a way that they're more modernized and fit the game style better. Again, you're never going to see anything on par with the effects presented in Final Fantasy XIV and other newer games, but they're functional, and a lot of them are nicer to view than they were in their previous iteration. In contrast to my complaint with Final Fantasy XIV's excessively long global cooldown, WoW has a much shorter global, and combat on certain classes feels fast and very enjoyable. Recently, WoW took a step back with certain spell types that were previously off the global cooldown and placed them back onto it to reduce the spamminess of those classes. But even with those changes, combat still flows far more quickly than with Final Fantasy XIV. These aspects, like many of the differences between the two, are a source of contention for the players of each game respectively. It will undoubtedly be the straw that breaks the camel's back for some who try both. I've known friends who love one and can't play the other, but in my opinion, although I prefer WoW's global cooldown to Final Fantasy XIV's, Final Fantasy XIV is not game-breaking because of the global cooldown being so slow. Once you're adjusted to the pacing of their combat and you reach high enough level to acquire many of your off-global cooldown abilities, both games are very well balanced around ensuring that primary functions are well done, and despite the differences in their graphical styles, both are at the top of what you could hope for out of each. On to the story. So this is the area I fully expect to get the most hate. I'll begin by stating that both games have great lore, and the largest differences are found in the fact that one is based on Western influence, while the other is based on traditional Japanese RPG standards, which I personally prefer. Start with WoW. WoW's lore is massive, spanning a huge number of books, RTS titles, and of course WoW itself. I mentioned in another video how impressed I am that they have been able to maintain a solid story for over 14 years in WoW alone, not counting the earlier RTS titles. WoW begins with you as just another soldier, and while they don't do a great job of foreshadowing your glorious future, that is by design, I think, as the game initially started off as a much more involved experience that took far longer to level through and reach the end of the game. When I first started playing WoW in 2004, I leveled my first mage to 60 without doing any quests, and simply killing everything in sight and running dungeons with my brother and friends as we were able. It took nearly 4 months to hit level 60, and when I did, it was one of my greatest and most proud moments in any game, but I was totally disconnected from the story. I've always been a huge fan of JRPGs, and the lack of questing on my part left me with a far different experience of what an MMO was than what I understand it to be today. After Vanilla, however, I re-rolled as an Alliance mage and quested through the Vanilla experience on the Alliance side, and then into the BC content and began to understand just how expansive WoW's lore was. While I don't think WoW has, and likely never will, present their story as well as other titles like Star Wars The Old Republic and of course Final Fantasy XIV, they've come a long way, and both Legion and Battle for Azeroth's questing experiences are a tribute to the increased focus they've placed on presenting their story in such a way that it is accessible to those who don't read the books or have the desire to find background information on lore characters via other media. Final Fantasy XIV, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Final Fantasy XIV concerning story. No one will dispute that Square Enix knows how to tell a great story. Their history is chock full of some of the greatest stories ever told in any media platform, and even the games I don't like as much, looking at you Final Fantasy XIII, weren't necessarily lacking in the story department so much as they weren't right for me in other areas. In fact, two of my favorite favorite games and stories, period, are from Square in the form of Chrono Trigger and Xenogears. Final Fantasy XIV is no different, but because it's an MMO, I have to look at each expansion independently. The game's base story was fantastic, and Heavensward was easily among my favorite Final Fantasy stories of all time. Stormblood lost some of its momentum for me, but that may have been due to the fact that war isn't really super interesting topic for me, and I came to the party late. More on that later. I played straight through from level 1 to Stormblood, and Heavensward is one heck of an experience to try to follow up. And while I feel like Stormblood did a great job in presenting fun, enjoyable content, it lacks something that to this very day I can't quite place, and the story just did not click for me on the same level. With that said, Final Fantasy XIV's story, and more so the presentation of the story, are by far the best of the bunch. I recommend Final Fantasy XIV to everyone for this reason, if none other. Whether you enjoy the game's combat, functions, aesthetics, or pacing, the story of Final Fantasy XIV is worth the trip through Eorzea, and with Stormbreakers on the horizon, now is a great time to make your way through and be ready for the next expansion when it drops in May of next year. Both WoW and Final Fantasy XIV are designed to present a great story. While Final Fantasy XIV's story and characters feel more alive and better positioned overall to me, I enjoy both equally, and WoW has made huge strides to improve their storytelling in-game. One other point I wanted to touch on is that the progression of your characters is also very different between the two. In Final Fantasy XIV, you start off as an adventurer who is unknown, and by its current endgame, you are a widely recognized force of good in the land who many, if not all of the primary lore characters respect, love, or fear, depending on their affiliation. In WoW, you start off as a nobody also, but the pacing on how you are recognized and by whom is a bit different. There seems to be more race-class identity in WoW, and oftentimes your primary interactions that present meaningful context take place with the leader of your race rather than the leader of a certain city-state. I feel like both stories are worth a playthrough, and both offer highs and lows that make for an interesting and unique experience. Go into PvP. This is the easiest of all the categories to cover, and I'm not even going to waste time breaking them down by game. WoW is superior in every way to Final Fantasy XIV when it comes to PvP. The engine, character design, primary functions concerning movement and fluidity of movement, global cooldown, and battle class design make WoW's PvP the uncontested winner between the two. Final Fantasy XIV doesn't even come close. Dungeons and raids. Again, I'm not going to separate the two. I feel like both are roughly equivalent in dungeon design and difficulty. WoW's raids are far superior in my opinion, as I do not like Final Fantasy XIV's raid design. This is a personal preference, and many will disagree, but a raid in WoW feels like an experience with your group, whereas in Final Fantasy XIV, I feel like I'm simply killing a boss with a group of people who happen to want to kill the same boss for loot. Just so I can be fair, however, I am a huge fan of Final Fantasy XIV's primals, and they more than make up for the lack of what I would consider quality, challenging, and enjoyable in-game content with raids when you do them at savage and extreme levels. Plus, mounts, my friend. Alright, so we're going to touch on the current state of each of the games. This is another area where, depending on when you're watching this video, could swing one way or another. At the time of writing this video, WoW's current expansion is BFA, and we're awaiting patch 8.1, while Final Fantasy XIV is at the end of Stormblood's life cycle, and we're anticipating patch 4.5, and Blue May. Final Fantasy XIV has exploded. According to Square Enix, most current report, Final Fantasy XIV has over 14 million registered users. Now, before we jump around and do a happy dance, registered users is not the same as active subscribers, but it is an impressive feat nonetheless. It brings it close to WoW's peak, if not surpassing it. Square Enix has been doing things right, and they are reaping the benefits of their hard work. The Japanese are very respectful people, and they pay homage to the director, Yoshi P, who brought the game back from death, and it's evident by watching them interact that they all have great respect and admiration for him and how he has led the team. Yoshi P is a bit of a showman, and as the face of Final Fantasy XIV, he does a great job in taking responsibility when they fail, and humbly accepting praise when they succeed. There are mixed feelings about some of the game's current systems and content, but there is no doubt that new and existing players are rarely without something to do because of the design of the game. The crafting system is, by far, one of the most rewarding crafting systems in any MMORPG, and it literally is how some people choose to play the game exclusively. Estrella is what's known as an omni-crafter, and has mastered all of the different gathering and crafting skills, and regularly finds finds herself with hundreds of millions of gil, which is Final Fantasy XIV's currency, and she's purchased a personal large house as well as a large house for our free company, which are guilds for those who are coming from WoW. If crafting is not your thing, like me, then there are 15 jobs equivalent of what we call classes in WoW that you can level, and all of them can be leveled on the same character. There is a large variety of optional things to do, ranging from collecting mounts, pets, and glamour, which is transmog, to working the casino for additional rewards and more. As mentioned before, Final Fantasy XIV also has housing, which, while the subject of much debate amongst the community, is another serious form of content. If you're fortunate enough to have the guild to purchase a house and find one available, decorating your house is pretty satisfying, and they've added features where you can sell armor you craft from your house and play like a shopkeep as well. Again, that's not really my speed, but it's there, and the game is better for it in my opinion. If you like to buy the coolest glamour and deck out your chocobo with the newest equipment like I do, you're probably broke and can't afford a house, but that's okay, because there's a limited number of apartments, and while a bit less satisfying than houses, can be decorated and personalized. As you can see here, mine is a bar, and while I never actually come here, it was hella fun to make, and we do occasionally have free company meetings here for the hell of it. Final Fantasy XIV has much to do despite having been out far less time than WoW, and I feel like most of it is quite enjoyable. Alright, jumping into WoW. The world of Warcraft. I love WoW. It's like your first girlfriend. You never really forget the things that made them awesome, and you would give pretty much anything if subsequent girlfriends could possess the traits you loved the most. However, time moves on and things change, and what seemed great at the time, in retrospect, are often actually just things you view differently because you were younger, dumber, and the world is a different place. WoW is no exception. My most treasured memory in any video game ever comes from vanilla WoW. You can hear more about that in our YouTube introduction video. But as time has passed, I feel less overwhelmingly drawn to spend all of my time in Azeroth. I've lost jobs over Azeroth, and even a stepmom who left my dad for someone she met in game. But the world is a different place now, and it cannot ever be the same again. The internet can tell you everything that you want to know, and we're all adept at using it. YouTube isn't a phenomenon anymore. It's a legitimate tool for connecting with other people and obtaining news on topics that interest you personally. And WoW, even classic WoW, cannot be a mystery or a black hole that can consume everything in the world. Now, don't misunderstand me, I'll play the hell out of some classic WoW when it comes out, but life is different now, and so are we. Anyway, WoW does not seem to be in a great place right now. Beyond the reports that there is trouble at Blizzard overall, BFA has not been met with the same level of love that its predecessor was. Legion was fantastic, and in my opinion, the best expansion since Wrath. While some of the negativity towards BFA may be similar to what I spoke about concerning Stormblood, and that having to follow up after something like Legion or Heavensward puts its successor in a precarious position by default, I don't feel like that's all there is to it. Astray and I don't raid much, nor do we PvP. Rather, we like to level through the content and play all of the classes. Because of that, we have a full roster on both the Alliance and the Horde, and I made it through about 6 characters leveling from 110 to 120 before I had to stop. It just isn't doing it for me. It's not the story. I feel like BFA's story is pretty on point, and following the groundwork Legion plays for storytelling in WoW quite well, although I've only played through the Alliance story so far, and it succeeds at telling a compelling tale. However, the systems in their current iteration are weak. Azerite armor is far less enjoyable than either artifact weapons or set bonuses, and the island expeditions and warfronts, despite being fun for a few runs, are more of a novelty than something I would want to really base an expansion's design around. Again, I feel like these systems are good in their own right, and as the expansion progresses will undoubtedly improve. Legion was not a well-oiled machine at first either, but between reports that there's trouble at Blizzard and that their subscriber count has plummeted to lows not seen in nearly a decade, WoW has some serious hurdles to straddle before they can count themselves out of the woods. Like Final Fantasy, WoW has a natural fanbase that will support WoW enough to make it viable to keep it running, at least for many years to come. One of the smartest things Blizzard has done recently was to create a Blizzard-approved, created and run vanilla experience for people to enjoy. Even if the people who choose to return for Classic never play retail, they're still paying to play it, and there is a chance that they will play retail at some point since they're paying for the subscription anyways. Patch 8.1 is looking to improve upon many of BFA's shortcomings and will hopefully revitalize the expansion to a point that will lead to a more positive experience thereafter. But time will tell, and even at its lowest point, WoW is still better than 99.9% of other MMOs out there, so take any criticisms you hear with a grain of salt, because the worst of the best is still better than the best of the worst. Lastly, I'm going to talk about my personal experience with each. We'll start off with WoW. I've spent quite a bit of time talking about this already, so I'll be brief. WoW is not only the first MMORPG I ever played, but it's the first PC game I ever played other than Frogger and the Amazon Trail. WoW will always be special to me, and I will always play it off and on as long as it exists. I started in vanilla a few days after launch because my brother had it and had me start a character on his account to try out. I was hooked and leveling every day until I hit max. I loved everything about it, and like I said before, literally lost a job to hit level 60. I played pretty religiously through all of BC and Wrath, and then I took a break that lasted all of Cataclysm and the first part of Mists of Pandaria. In fact, it wasn't until Estrella told me she wanted to try it out that I returned, and she was hooked by level 10, and now we have 24 level 110 plus characters. I love playing together and with friends. For Final Fantasy XIV, as I mentioned earlier, they had a terrible 1.0 launch, and even though I bought the game, I played it for a total of about 10 hours before returning to WoW, fully expecting for it to die off quickly and quietly while we waited for the next entry into the series. Speaking for myself alone, I was getting a bit frustrated with Square Enix as I did not enjoy Final Fantasy XIII either, and I had to literally force myself to the end of the credits upon completion, and I feared for the series' future. Not quite 3 years later, I received a random email from Square Enix stating that I would be able to download 2.0 for free, and that I would receive a certain amount of free game time as well as a tattoo and a mount. At the time, I had quit playing games almost altogether other than the occasional console RPG that caught my attention, so I was less than interested in revisiting what I had considered to be a failure of a game. But the subtitle, A Realm Reborn, was interesting, so I downloaded the launcher, and I wouldn't find out until much later how masterfully Yoshi P and the team had integrated 1.0 and 2.0 through a series of world-ending scenarios and a final send-off to 1.0 that is one of the coolest things I've ever heard about in a game, and I'm sorry that I missed experiencing it. It's definitely worth checking out, and there are plenty of videos that discuss the transformation in great detail. I missed the initial launch of 2.0 as well because, to be honest, I forgot. But my younger brother did not, and he called me a few weeks in to tell me that I needed to give it another shot. I jumped on and made a pugilist and leveled it to 30, so I could actually be a monk. Life was moving a million miles a second at the time, and Estrella and I were 100% occupied with raising our children and work, so I let it go to the wayside, and I was content with Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic the Gathering with my boys for entertainment. Fast forward to Stormblood, my boys had outgrown card games in favor of other activities, and Estrella had asked me to play WoW with her, and we'd enjoyed our time with it. At some point, however, I tired of WoW. We all know the burnout that comes when you play a game far too much, and I decided to give Final Fantasy XIV another shot. I had lost my account information and was far too busy to spend the time it took to retrieve it for an email I didn't even have anymore, and a game I may not play past level 30. So I purchased a fresh account, assuming that if I wanted to invest into it further, I could just give this account to Estrella and reclaim my original. I dove in head first, and the changes Square Enix had made to the class system were exactly what I needed to feel invested. I enjoy making alts, and although even today Final Fantasy XIV doesn't require them, being able to make an alt without having to grind every job across multiple characters made it more accessible to me with the limited time I had to play. Today I've leveled most of the battle classes to max, except healers. I don't heal, and I fish some, but Estrella is crafting on lock, so I don't even need to do that. I love Final Fantasy XIV's story, and I'm super excited for the next expansion and Blue Mage, as well as whatever jobs they may add. Thanks for spending some time with us today, and we hope you enjoyed our video. My final verdict is that currently Final Fantasy XIV is the place to be, and I expect it to be so for the foreseeable future. WoW will always be fun, but I feel like Final Fantasy XIV is looking to break the mold, and they're on the verge of doing just that. Alright, well I hope you assholes enjoyed this video. Be sure to comment below, and if you enjoyed the video or hated it, punch me in the face with the like button and subscribe. If you're extra salty that I dared to tread on your feelings on a whim, prove it to everyone and wipe your tears with the dislike button and subscribe anyway so I can feed on your bitterness next time. I'm Zia with Kick-Ass Gaming, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.